When I was 17 or so, two friends and I decided to camp in the field next to my housing estate so we could drink beer and listen to music as loud as we wanted. This was a huge grassy field on a slight hill where all the surrounding houses were far away enough so that we wouldn't disturb the neighbors, and we couldn't be seen by anyone unless they were extremely close to our tent. It became late, and my two friends had fallen asleep. I was having trouble sleeping around this time, so I lay awake for hours just thinking. Around 3 a.m., I heard the distinct sound of grass and vegetation as someone walked on it outside our tent. I was stunned with terror. For one, because this was a private field owned by a farmer who would probably be angry to find us there, but more so because I hadn't heard anyone approaching. Just suddenly, there was someone outside the tent. I held my breath out of fear and shock, which is when I heard another set of footsteps belonging to a dog by the sound of it. Filled with dread, I just lay as still as possible, breathing slowly and quietly, listening to this person and his dog walking back and forth outside the tent. I thought we were going to get shot or beaten by this dude. Then I saw this guy's shadow, which freaked me out a hell of a lot more than I already was. It was huge and looming over us every time he passed our tent, and I couldn't see the dog's shadow, even though I heard it making increasingly erratic circulations of the tent. This carried on for around 5 minutes, although it felt like much more time had passed. The shadows disappeared, and the sounds faded away. They didn't leave or anything. It was more like they were still walking outside of the tent, but with perpetually lighter footing. When I was sure that the sounds had ceased and there was no threat waiting for me outside, I freaked out at my friends, still as quiet as possible, and said we had to go because someone knew we were here and we could get in trouble with the owner. I told them everything that had happened, and they didn't believe me, thinking I had been asleep as well and dreamt the whole thing. I assured them I hadn't, and that we had to go right now. They tried to get back to sleep, ignoring me because they're lazy as hell and didn't want to pack everything up and go. I gave up too, even though I knew now that I'd never get to sleep. 10 minutes later, the sounds returned, just like the volume outside had been turned up gradually. I felt the same dread I had felt before, and whispered one of my friends' names so that they could wake up and hear. "Shh," one said. They had already heard, and told me to open the tent to see who was terrorizing us. I did so, slowly easing my hand out of the sleeping bag and up to the zipper. It probably took 5 minutes for me to reach it, just so I was sure not to make a sound, and I pulled it down so violently I nearly ripped the whole thing in half. There was nobody there. We got out within the space of 5 seconds, and there was nobody anywhere. As I mentioned, we were atop a hill in the middle of a field, and so could see if anyone had decided to run. But there was nothing. Even though it was impossible for anyone to escape my seeing them, I am absolutely positive there were footsteps outside our tent that night. Let me preface with this. I hate camping. I hate being cold, wet, uncomfortable, scared, and without an internet connection. Even more than camping, I hate hiking into a place to camp. You know what's worse than being cold, wet, uncomfortable, scared, and without an internet connection? It's being those things, plus being tired from walking all day. Generally, the closest to camping I will do is to rent a cabin in the mountains, with electricity and usually Wi-Fi, and drive up to it. With those things in mind, I somehow let 2 of my friends talk me into hiking and camping for part of my fall break during my junior year of college. The area we drove up to stay at is right on the border between East Tennessee and North Carolina. We were planning on staying 3 days, walking for a day and a half, camping, walking back for half a day, camping, then finishing the walk back and staying a 3rd night if needed. Leisure hiking, we really had no idea where we were going to hike to, and had just kind of figured we would play it by ear. Everything went great the first night, other than maybe being a wee bit too cold for my liking after the sun went down. Nice bright sunny day, spent most of the night drinking and bitching about school. Laying in the tent, I almost forgot that I hated camping and was jokingly considering taking it up as a hobby. Then the next morning, Right as we were packing up, I was suddenly reminded of all the things I hated about the great outdoors. The sky opened up and decided to piss all over our good time. The nice low 70s quickly turned into the mid-50s as the sun ducked in and out of the clouds. If it had been a constant rain, I could have probably talked the other guys with me into either putting down the tent or turning back. But the weather in the mountains is finicky at best and malicious at worst. At times it felt like standing under a faucet and having someone turn it on again and off again. The rest of the time it felt like walking through a clingy mist. I guess that's why they call them the Great Smoky Mountains. Without a constant downpour, my slave-driving hiking mates insisted on pushing on, since it'll be fine, it'll clear up again in a minute. As the second half of the day wore on, and the sun decided it was done trying to fight the clouds and was going to bed, I finally dropped the tent on the ground and warned my friends I was going no further. As I had the only tent, they could either stay there for the night or they could sleep under the rain clouds. An hour and a change of socks later, the tent was up, the fire was drying out our hiking clothes, and I was in a foul mood. The only thing keeping my spirits high at all was the second half of the bottle of spirits I had from the night before. Our bitching about school turned into bitching about the weather, and despite how the rain had been thus far, the clouds held off for the night. This is the part where I'd like to say I had a weird feeling, or my instincts felt off, or whatever. Truth is, I didn't feel shit other than soaked to the bone. However, I did notice my buddy Tim kept glancing off into the forest, into the darkness just outside the reach of the firelight. After a while, it kind of started freaking me out, so I asked him what he was looking at. He just said he wasn't feeling well, and was kind of creeped out. This immediately creeped me out, and all three of us retrieved our pistols from our tent. The mountains in East Tennessee are notorious for black bears, but they are mostly harmless. They spook easy and don't come back in greater numbers, and as long as you don't walk up on their cubs, you are pretty fine. Still, I didn't really want to take any chances, and there are plenty of other things in the forests of the world to be scared of other than bears. We decided that with the day's rainfall, catching anything on fire was going to be a non-issue, and left the fire slightly burning, mostly just hot embers. Into the tent we went. We had arranged our sleeping bags in a triangle, and had some of our gear, including firearms, stashed in our bags in the middle. As the rain had still held off, we left the tent flap a little unzipped so we could keep an eye on the fire. A few more minutes of chatting, and I finally loose my battle with exhaustion and pass out. What felt like a very short time later, I remember sitting bolt upright, well, as upright as one can get in a sleeping bag, at the sound of something moving outside the tent. I look at my hiking companions and see that they too are now fully awake. We alternate between staring at each other and staring at the dim firelight coming in through the slightly open tent flap. Just as I move to try to look out of the flap, we hear what sounds like a bottle of water being cracked open. Then shh, and the fire dies immediately. Sitting now completely in the dark, I felt like a cartoon character who could only see the eyes of my companions. We gave one brief look at each other, then dove for the bags in the middle, scrambling for weapons and flashlights. A few panic-stricken seconds later, and all three of us gingerly tiptoe out of the tent, trying to ascertain if we are being threatened or, what else could it really be? Nothing. No one was there. Whoever had doused our campfire had thrown the empty bottle of water on the ground and got the hell out of Dodge. Now this is the strange part. Okay, so someone came across our camp and decided to fuck with us? Big deal, right? Other than the empty water bottle, the only thing that would have even left us knowing someone had been there was a small rubber octopus sitting on a rock next to the now extinguished campfire. It sounds stupid at first, and laughably hilarious out of context, but for the rest of that night, we were terrified. That stupid little rubber octopus meant that someone had been watching us after all. I was a counselor at a summer camp in northern Michigan. We stayed in a huge circle of cabins bordered by woods. There are tons of ghost stories and whatnot passed around to scare campers. 8 to 15 years old for the most part. The counselors are usually in on it. Some counselors insist they really have seen some unexplainable shit. I believe them. Well, one night, about 1 in the morning, my bladder alarm goes off, and I step outside. As I'm peeing, I hear the faint laughter of children, which isn't necessarily uncommon. There are about 250 kids attending. Well, I listen closer, and I realize it's coming from the woods behind our cabin. The woods I'm referring to go for about 50 feet and open up into a ginormous field we use for all kinds of activities. My assumption is that some kids snuck out and were returning from the field. I didn't hear any footsteps, which I thought was odd because the floor of the woods is covered in dead leaves and the like. The laughter keeps going. I'm sure I hear it, not just my tired mind playing tricks on me. About 50 feet down from where I'm peeing along the forest, I see 2 young boys, probably 10 or so, walk out of the forest and between my cabin and the one next door into the open area in the middle of the cabins. At this point, I'm still peeing, so I keep quiet, don't want a kid laying eyes on my pecker and ending up on a list. I shake my shaft furiously and zip up. I walk around to the other side of the cabin to reprimand these kids, and no one is there. I don't hear laughter or anything. They're really nowhere for them to have disappeared to. I was in sight of the adjacent cabin's door, and they didn't go in there. If they went in mine, I would have heard it. I tried to chalk it up to delirium, but I am 1000% sure of what I saw. I walked around the area and no sign of the 2 boys I had both heard and saw. I played in bed, looking at the ceiling till the sun came up, and to this day, my eyes well up when the thought crosses my mind. I will never be able to comfortably explain what I experienced. It didn't help that some counselors didn't believe me. Edit. Forgot to mention it's an old, all-boys Catholic camp. I was about 18 at the time. Ooh, yay! Finally a place to share this story. At my high school, all the seniors went on an annual camping/rafting trip up in Maine. My class only had 90 kids. All the kids got assigned cabins, 4 to a cabin. The campground was beautiful. It was right on this huge lake, right at the bottom of a mountain. On the first night that we were there, some of the people who worked there sat around this huge bonfire with us and told us the story of a ghost who haunted the grounds. Apparently, the campground used to belong to a rich family back in the early 1900s, and the daughter of the owner drowned in the river or something, while sneaking around after dark with her lover. They said that if you were in bed and you heard the sound of rushing water, like a river, she was outside waiting to guide you to the river. If you saw her light, you'd be entranced and she'd walk you to your watery death. The teachers told us that they only told the story to scare kids from leaving their cabins after bedtime, and that it wasn't real. I got paired up with 3 other girls in my cabin, and we stayed up the first night, giggling/talking. By the time we finally fell asleep around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud sound. It sounded like something large splashing in water. The lake was nowhere near the cabins, by the way. You had to walk like 15 minutes to get to the water/main hall from the cabins, and the river was at least 3 or 4 miles away. I figured it was a dream or something, so I ignored it. But a few minutes later, it happened again. I looked over and saw 2 of the other girls wide awake, petrified. One of them looked out the small window, but no one was there. We didn't sleep well that night. None of the other kids heard the noise, except for a group of boys whose cabin was very far from us. They said they heard it around 1 a.m., right outside their cabin, and when they woke up, there was a bright light shining into their cabin. When they looked out, they could see a light flashing in the dark trees. We all confronted the campground people, but they all said they had nothing to do with it. The teachers did runs every now and then throughout the night to check to make sure students weren't out of bed flashing, but they said they didn't see or hear anything. We didn't believe them, and one of the girls in my cabin was so scared that she wanted to go home. She called her mom and everything to come get her. Keep in mind, this trip cost all of us a lot of money, and we had paid for 3 days. The teachers tried to calm her down, and campground people insisted on staying up with us to see if it happened again. She stayed. The next night, the teacher stayed outside our cabin, while the campground people stayed outside the boys' cabin. All of the students were accounted for. One of the teachers continued to walk around and check on the cabins, so nobody was out of bed. Nothing happened for a while, so I eventually fell asleep. I woke up what seemed like minutes later to one of my cabin mates screaming and pointing at the door. I looked over and saw really long, dark, wet hair dangling in front of the window. The teachers came running in, and a few minutes later, so did the campground people. The other girl was sobbing, and it woke everyone up. We told them what we saw, but the campground people said nobody else was staying in the campground, and the teachers confirmed that everyone was accounted for, / nobody had wet hair. Nobody slept that night, and for the last night, we all just camped out in the main hall because we were too scared to sleep in the cabins. I forgot about it until now. I've always figured that either the teachers or workers there were playing a sick joke, but I guess I'll never know. So, this was actually quite recent, like within the last 2 weeks. My friend and I had gone up to Gifford-Pinchot National Forest the day after the 4th of July to meet my parents who were camping up there. I knew right where the spot was. We've always camped in the same spot since I was a kid. From the start of the weekend, it seemed destined to be a shitty camping experience. And of course, it was my friend's first time camping. We pulled onto the road where my parents were camped, and there was still about a half mile to go when, what do you know, I get a flat tire. Now, I didn't think anything of it as being paranormal or weird like that at that moment, because there are sharp-ass rock up there, and my tires were less than ideal for that situation. So we walked down the road to camp, and surprisingly didn't hear anything or notice anything unusual while walking. We got the flat fixed in no time when I got to camp, because my dad, grandpa, and uncle had all the tools necessary. So the day goes on. We went swimming in a few of the surrounding lakes, went driving around, and so on. This area has always been a little weird to me. I don't even know why. I've been camping up there for over 15 years, yet it still sometimes gives me the creeps, even in broad daylight. But I guess that shows how much of a pussy I am. We went back to camp after swimming and hanging out and just chilled. It was about 4 in the afternoon, and my dad asked if he could use my SUV to take my grandparents to this spot. He couldn't go with his truck because it's so big. I said, sure, have fun. He leaves me the 357 just to be safe. We always do that when one of us is going to be staying back at camp, and that precaution is more for people than animals. So my friend and I are just chilling. The dogs are in the trailer. We're just hanging out talking, sitting around the fire. It wasn't dark at all, not even close to it, but the clouds had started to roll in, and we were weary it was going to rain, as we had set up a tent for the night, but luckily it didn't. So we were sitting there when all of a sudden we hear this huge snap. My friend seemed pretty freaked out, but I explained to her that it was probably a deer and that happened all the time up here, but then we kept hearing it. And then the dogs starting barking from inside the trailer. I started thinking maybe it was some asshole trying to mess with us or someone drunk because it was right after the 4th and people do like to celebrate up there. We tried to ignore it as best as we could. It eventually stopped when we started talking louder and louder, leading me to believe it was an animal all along. Later that night, when we were all snuggled into our tent, after everyone had gotten back and we had all ate dinner and dessert, my friend and I were just laying there talking. The fire was still crackling, so anything I heard crack, I chalked it up to the noise being the fire. My parents and grandparents were both about 30 feet away in their trailers, so I wasn't too worried about anything. My dad had let me keep his bear spray in the tent, should we need it. So, we're talking, and it's getting to be about midnight, and mind you, no one up there is usually out and about that late. I say usually because there is the occasional person that gets up there late or is just running the roads at night. But what I will say is the road we were camped on is not one that is traveled very often, if at all. And I'm not saying that for the shock value at all, it's just the truth. Just as we were both drifting off to sleep, we both hear a gunshot, not any farther than probably 50 feet down the road. My friend and I collectively popped up and asked each other, "Did you fucking hear that?" But it didn't stop at all. No, it kept going for at least another 6 or 7 shots right down the road. Now, my first thought was that someone was in trouble, but then I realized that no one had driven down the road all day. Someone had been at the camp at all times, and no one had driven past it or anything, but the gunshots sounded just down from our camp. So someone had either walked down there or drove a fucking Prius on the most potholed roads in the world, which I highly doubted. I grabbed the bear spray, ready for some asshole to come barging into the camp. My friend was like, "Why isn't your dad up? How did he not hear that?" And I did not know what to tell her because he was the lightest sleeper in the world, and he wakes up from the slightest noises, so him not hearing it was next to impossible. The gunshots had stopped about 5 minutes before, when all of a sudden they started up again, even closer this time. I was about to unzip the tent and run to the trailer to get my dad, because I wasn't about to just have some asshole come into the tent and kill my friend and I. I unzipped the tent, and my dad was already getting out of the trailer with his handgun ready to go. "Stay in the tent," he said, so we both stayed in the tent and waited. We waited what felt like 30 minutes or so, but was probably only 5. He finally unzips the tent and is like, "Why don't you both sleep in the trailer with us tonight?" So we both booked our asses into the trailer. We didn't have to be asked twice. For the rest of the night, we didn't hear anything. I literally was up all night, waiting for someone or something to knock on the door or blast it with a gun. When we all got up in the morning, when it was pretty light outside, we walked down the road to see if there was a car or anything, where we all heard the gunshots. There was nothing, of course, but there were these weird things tied in the trees right at the edge of the road. It was dead bear grass that had strings wrapped around it and was hanging on several trees. My dad has a picture of them on his camera, so I'll ask him tomorrow when I see him if he'll let me upload them. It was fucking insane. I don't know if it was paranormal or just some fucking asshole drunk off his ass. Either way, it was a stupid thing to do, because he could have been seriously hurt if he were to walk into the camp. Nothing else happened that weekend, but you bet your asses we stayed in the trailer. Ain't nobody got time for that. This actually happened yesterday. My family and I decided that we wanted to see Washington, D.C., so we drove for maybe 12 hours, and we arrived at our campgrounds. Now, you wouldn't call what we were doing camping, more like glamping. We are camping in something called a yurt. It has wooden beams in a cylinder shape with cloth around it. It has a small TV, a mini fridge, and a microwave. Yeah, no, really roughing it. So for the first 3 days, we drive to the bus depot, then take a bus to DC and do tourist things from there. So on the 3rd day, when we were done, we took the bus back to the depot. When we were driving back to the campsite, the car just starts vibrating. When we get back to the camp, my father checks out the tires. He doesn't see anything wrong, but doesn't feel comfortable driving around with it. So he said that we aren't going to be doing any sightseeing tomorrow on account of the tire and him going to get it fixed. So the 4th day comes around, and my father and mother leave my brother and I to mess around for the day as they get the tire fixed. They leave at about 11 in the morning. So my brother and I have the tent yurt to ourselves. Being the lazy teenagers we are, we just turn on the TV and watch TV for a few hours. He fell asleep 30 minutes in. It had been about 1 hour since our parents had been gone. The window cover was flapping back and forth in the wind. It was eerie, but I passed it, and the gut feeling off as being just the wind. About 25 minutes I hear the back door jiggle a little. I had locked it earlier in the day. I thought it was the parents messing with us, as I tried to scare them constantly. I heard footsteps trying to creep to the front door unsuccessfully. I decided that I wasn't going to let me scare them, so I just ignored it. I hear the door open up behind me, but ignore it to not let them try and scare me, despite my stomach feeling like it wants to spew out onto the floor. I never heard the door close, so 5 minutes later, I finally turned around. The door was wide open. I started to get really nervous at this point. I wake up my brother and tell him what happened. He tells me to stop being such a whiny little bitch and goes back to sleep. Now the door was open for the whole conversation. Because I was too distracted telling my brother what happened, I had forgotten about closing it. So I go to close it. As I was walking up, I started to think it was my parents trying to scare me again. I close and lock the door. I lie down and start watching the shitty movie. And the reason they left the door open was they had forgotten something at the store and were in a rush to get back. 5 minutes later, I get a text from my mom saying that they should be back in 2 or 3 hours. I ask them why they came back to camp. She responds that they never came back and have been in line the entire time. I almost cried for fear. I play some Pandora on my phone and browse some Ask Reddit. Browsing creepy threads because I hate myself. The parents call me saying that they will be home in maybe 45 minutes. Maybe 20 minutes later, I hear footsteps. They were quiet at first, like at the entrance of the campsite, but they got closer and close until they were almost right outside of the yurt right beside me. The only thing that was between me and this person was a thing of fabric, some wood, and insulation. I was on the opposite side or the yurt than my brother. I screamed his name as loud as I could. The man-thing scurried off. My parents came home 20 minutes later. I explain it to them. My mom says it was probably my imagination. I said it wasn't and that there was someone out there. My dad decides that he has had enough and went to go check out if someone was out there. He checked where I was, correlating to outside when he ran off after I screamed for my brother. He found nothing. They still say it was my imagination, but I know it wasn't. I have one more day here. I hope to God he doesn't come back. Every year after our college semester was over during the summer, me and my bros would reunite and go camping at our usual spot. As we got to our campground, everything felt normal. We did our old and same routine, unpacking and setting up camp, then scavenging for wood and whatnot. As it got dark, most of us started to feel uneasy, and it felt like there was a huge negative energy around our camp. Most of the bros grew tired, so they slept first, and it was weird. The ones that slept were the ones that would stay up the latest during camp. And so first night was uneasy and weird. The very next morning, one of the bro had a nightmare that we were camping on an old lady's home, and she was going to take him with her if we don't leave. Now that idiot shrugged it off, but inside he was scared to death. Now that night, everything was kind of crazy. I believe that if someone is afraid and is showing fear, the supernatural, or what else is out there, can easily use that to cause harm to the living. And so that night, our propane lanterns broke. By the way, new propane, new nets and everything. All we had was our fire and our flashlights. And so we went to sleep because everything felt uneasy, and that night, almost everyone heard something dragging wood and walking and shuffling their feet around our tent. It wasn't like an animal because I hunt with my family, and I know how deers, bears, and other animals tread through the dirt and whatnot. And so me and my best friend didn't want others to be afraid because they were already giving off too much negative energy. So I pulled out my Glock and fired 2 rounds into the sky, and he fired 1 whole clip of his AR. After that, we all pretty much stayed awake and the noise stopped. And the next morning, there were weird human tracks around, or tent, and long trails of wood being dragged around our camp. First off, I love to camp. Been doing it my whole life. Never had a scary experience until this past summer. My boyfriend and I decided to go out to the gorge for some quality time camping. We had always gone with several other people, but this was the first time it was just us 2. When we got out of the car to prep our gear for the mile hike back to the camping spot, 2 sketchy-looking dudes came out of the trailhead, eyed us, and went on to their old-school VW camper van. I had a weird feeling, but shrugged it off and proceeded back to our camping spot. I had previously camped in the same area a handful of times and knew it pretty well. Once we got back there, I knew of a handful of different camping spots and proceeded to check them all out for the one that would be ideal for us. I noticed what looked like someone camping further up the hill, so I picked a spot a little further down where we'd be mostly out of sight. Not out of earshot, though, as I heard him yelling with someone else back over on the trail. It was starting to get dark by the time we got everything set up, so I figured I'd start looking for firewood. Suddenly, this guy appears out of nowhere and asks us if we'd like any help, and offered to sell us a bundle of firewood for $10. I laughed because we were in the woods, thus surrounded by wood, which I could pick up off the ground for free. He then said I wouldn't find much wood because they'd already cleared it out over the past few weeks. Few weeks? I asked him how long he'd been camping up there, and he said almost a month. The longest anyone can camp in this area, a national forest, is 2 weeks. I already had the creeps about him, and he claimed he was up there by himself. I asked him why I heard him yelling with someone then, and that he had referred to more people when talking about the wood. He stammered and was like, yeah, there's some dudes I know camping over there up on the other side of the river. Then he proceeds to tell us that he's been lonely since he arrived. He was from Pennsylvania, took a bus to Lexington, KY, and had been living in the woods back behind where I currently work. Coincidental? I knew exactly where he was talking about because I see homeless people, immigrants, and drug addicts coming in and out of those woods every day. So, basically he was a homeless man who somehow got a ride out to the gorge and decided he would just live there instead. He had been living on snakes, bugs, and selling firewood for food, beer. But he said we were the first people he'd seen in a few weeks. His stories were all over the place, and I knew he was lying about a lot of what he told us. He wasn't alone, even though he claimed to be. He even took us to his camp where there was tons of stuff for several guys, not just one. He said he liked camping up top, where he could see everything and everyone. Then showed up our campsite. He had a straight shot view. By now it was dark, and he helped us get a fire going. I was trying to politely get him on his way back up the hill so I could have a minute to process all of this. When he left, I started whispering to my boyfriend that there was no way in hell I could sleep with that lying, sketchy homeless creep right up the hill. We didn't have a gun, knife, or even dog to protect ourselves if we needed to. I said, let's quietly get our shit together and get the hell out of here. Which we did, only we left our new tarps set up because they would make too much noise and he'd know we were leaving. As soon as I stood up with my pack, ready to get the hell out of Dodge, he yells, "How's it going down there?" And we proceeded to get the hell out as quickly and quietly as possible. In my mind, we were either getting robbed, raped, killed, or something because he was not alone. His stories didn't add up, and his background of where he came from made me believe he was running from something and was trying to hide by living off the grid. I called the Rangers the next morning and told them about him. Luckily, all he got from us was a set of new tarps. We were camping for 4 days in an area of the Red Feather Lakes in Colorado for 4 days, deep into the woods, 20 miles down a dirt road without anyone else in sight. We came in during the day and didn't notice anything unusual. We had enough supplies for maybe 6 days for our party. My wife and I, my brother-in-law, my 3 nephews ages 5, 6, 8, and our dogs. Day 1 was amazing. Hiking, fishing, stargazing, and s'mores. Dogs loved roaming around. The next day was equally as amazing. Lots of activities. Yard games like cornhole and board games with the boys. Around 6 p.m. though, the mood atmosphere changed with the dogs. Suddenly, they were seemingly very on edge. Patrolling the edge of our camp, hackles raised, occasionally growling at the woods. We didn't think a whole lot of it. We had hiked into the woods for miles and everything was just forest in every direction for miles and miles. There was a hill we could go up another, plus 700 feet, that we'd get above the tree line for stargazing, and we could see in every direction. No other lights, campfires, etc. Figured the dogs were detecting wildlife, maybe a curious black bear or even a mountain lion. They're big dogs, we're armed, we didn't let the kids wander too far from sight, but again, it didn't seem like an issue. That night, us adults stayed up around the campfire till 1 a.m. or so. I kept getting a feeling that something was watching us. I was more on edge than I've been, and we're avid campers with plenty of experiences, run-ins with bears and other wildlife while in the woods. It just felt different. When we finally went to bed, I don't think I slept more than half an hour at a time, and swore I'd hear the occasional crack of branches off in the woods. The next day, we didn't notice anything off about the camp, although my brother suspected something had happened to our water. We had 5 or 6 of those 5-gallon jugs with the little pull-out spigot on them. 2 were in my truck, 1 in our tent, 1 in his car, and the remaining 2 appeared drained, although it might have been the boys or a leak. We decided we might pack it in after lunch on day 3. We didn't want to end the trip early, but stuff just felt so strange. The boys were sad and we were back and forth on if we were being paranoid, but the dogs were just seemingly so on guard and were going crazy, running around sniffing like crazy when we went on our hike that day. After lunch, we started packing up our gear. 2 tents, games, food, etc. Takes a while to pack up, especially with 3 little boys running around like crazy and weren't in a rush. By the time we were all loaded up, we decided we'd heat up a quick dinner. The boys had one last request. They wanted to go snipe hunting. Still had an hour or so of daylight left, so we were fine with it. We went off into the forest and did the classic snipe hunt thing. BL in the front, leading us in a wide circle that ended back at the camp, my wife in the middle of the boys, me trailing the rear. I'd pick up small rocks and sticks, and when the boys were looking away, I toss a rock or stick, and they jump all scared, and the other 2 adults go, "Oh my gosh, I think the snipe went this way." It's good fun. Well, as the sun was going down a bit more, not dark but setting, and we're nearing camp, a rock the size of 2 fists comes flying in, barely kissing one of my nephews. The adults look back and me like I'm crazy, and I'm like, that wasn't me. Another rock comes in and hits me square in the back. We don't even ask questions, time to go. Each adult grabs a kid and we book it back to our cars. The woods are moving behind us as we get to the cars. Bushes shaking, tree branches cracking and popping. We're all loaded up, I think, if we left anything behind. Sorry to the Forest Service. We've got about 20 miles of dirt road back to concrete. We get maybe a quarter mile into our drive and suddenly the road is littered with bones and animal carcasses. Beheaded deer and raccoon bodies. Some fresh, others just bones. We're driving left and right, trying to avoid hitting any of the more recently dead animals. I know it's hard to believe, but it's like this for what feels like nearly a full mile. Just bones and torn up animals. We finally make it through, and it's clear driving for another couple miles or so. We get to a clearing, and I see a green bus pulled off in a clearing for another campsite. I, for some reason, decide I'm going to stop and see if anyone is there to tell them something is up. My brother keeps going down the road with my nephews. My wife stays in the car. I approach the green bus to see if anyone is around. As I get close to the bus, I see the bus is super run down. Flat tires, newspapers over the windows, peeling paint. There's a big fire pit dug out, maybe 20 by 20 feet. Pretty deep too. Inside is just like an immense pile of bones. I see moose antlers, femurs of all sizes, rib cages. It felt like 40 animals worth of bones. I'm glancing around and there's all sorts of little symbols on the bus and tied up in the trees with string, a few smaller hanging dead animals. I just booked it back to the truck and said nope to my wife, and we hauled ass down the road to catch up with my brother. Whole stop lasted maybe a minute. That's the end. I don't know if it was poachers, cultists, combo of the two. Maybe some sort of weird Wiccans or just some resourceful meth addicts or something. In the end, I'm glad we never found out. I was 7, and my mom wanted to do family bonding with my siblings and her now ex-boyfriend and his son. We got there and something happened during the last night. I got up to go pee, and right when I got out there was a man right across the car park. The tent was set up on a small hill, not too far away from one side of the car park. I stood there scared out of my mind. The man was on the furthest side of the car park. I couldn't make out his face, it couldn't move. As my dumb ass decided to watch the Weeping Angels episode of Doctor Who, The Carried Here. So I didn't blink, and then he started to walk slowly, very slowly, like in a teasing way. I knew it wasn't anyone. I knew, but I started grab my small gold cross necklace, put it in my lips, and started to whisper prayers. I had memorized. I was silently crying and thought I was going to die. But when my mom's now ex-boyfriend came outside the tent, it turned around and he looked worried, asked if I was okay. It told to shush and said, "There's someone watching us." He looked confused, and without looking from fear, I pointed to the car park. He looked more confused, and I turned around, and there was nothing there. He walked over to me and picked me up and hugged me. I wrapped my arms around his neck, and he held me until I fell back asleep. I don't know if what is seen was real as all throughout my life. I've seen things that weren't there, but this felt surreal and never told anyone. And when I got back, things changed for me. It's even fucking years old. I planned to escape her outside of my house through my window. I slept with my shoes on and a knife under my pillow. I slept with an Eddie at my back and used my hands to cover my throat and arms to cover my gut. My face was pressed to the wall, so if someone came in, they couldn't see me face awake. I also nearly purposely hurt my leg during sports day. Did not tell anyone and still ran to see if I could run with a damaged leg. I don't know why this stuck with me so much, but my mom never found out. The only person who knows is my school counselor. The second story builds off seeing things that aren't there. Weirdly, there is a wooded area, not really a forest as it wasn't big where I live. The entrance behind the local pub's sketchy, I know. Since where I lived wasn't dangerous, you could stay out for hours one night. I stayed out till around 12 a.m. at night. The one rule my mom had was no forest past 6. But my 10-year-old ass decided, let's be a rebel, and would I regret this? Yes. It took one of my friends and her brother's company. We decided to go to the rope swing there and agreed on 3 turns. Each we had all had one swing, and so far we're having fun. Until I looked at the branch next to it, which was right in front of me. I seen a shadow hanging from the branch, swinging by the neck from a noose. It was clutched at the noose and the hanging arms and legs and screamed like Jenna Ortega. Xandrin is lipped and hit my head on a tree trunk and blacked out. I woke up minutes later and could still see it. My friend and her brother walked over confused and scared. My head was buried in the ground, and I was still wearing the cross necklace from the last story, and I started shouting prayers, and when my head stopped shaking, it was gone. We left running when I got out and was right in front of the forest. I threw up. The last story isn't as bad and long, but I was 12 with the same friend. We went back into the forest. Thankfully, during the day we went in, and in a enclosed bit we found small nooses with Barbies that were made to look like us in them. We took them down, left, and we burnt them in her fireplace while her parents were away. We haven't spoke about that since. Thank you for watching. If you like the stories, please subscribe. Until the next one.